We're privileged this morning to have Dr. Virginia Matzek, who traveled here from another warm, sunny clime compared to, although today it's supposed to be beautiful here. So you guys are going to have some nice cool weather to enjoy while you're here. Virginia is an assistant professor at Santa Clara University, focuses a lot on ecosystem services, and then she's going to talk a little bit more about how managers use scientific information today. This kind of kicks off what I hope will start you guys thinking about how you make your management decisions and how you access information. So if you would please join me in welcoming Virginia.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here, and I wanted to thank Brian for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to speak to a different audience than I have before. I'm going to apologize just a little bit for the fact that a lot of this is about California, but I'm hoping that you'll find it relevant to what you all do as well. Just to get a sense of the audience, how many of you consider yourselves land managers or resource managers in your jobs? Raise your hand. Okay. And what about scientists or researchers? Okay. Students? Okay. Well, so what I like there too is that a lot of people raise their hands for at least two of those, or all three. So good, 'cause I'm going to talk some about being both a scientist and a practitioner. So I work on invasive species restoration ecology and the ecosystem services that come from restoration. And I'm going to talk today about two studies that I've recently done that address this question of a knowing-doing gap of trying to get information into the hands of managers and what the challenges and obstacles are. Just come on in, don't. But before I do, I want to talk a little bit about cocktail parties. And I'm thinking back to when I was in grad school and when I would go to a cocktail party, and for those of you in grad school, this is what they were all like, right? You know, really beautiful people drinking champagne all the time, pretty much? Yeah? Okay. But I would meet people who weren't scientists and who weren't grad students, and they would ask what I did, and they would feign interest in my research, and I would say that, you know, I was working on functional traits of invasive species, blah, blah, blah. And they'd be like, oh, so what's that good for? And I'd kind of hem and haw. I'd say, well, invasive species are bad, and that maybe managers could learn something from my work. And you know, as time went on, I realized that this was a complete crock, and that I had never met a manager, that I had really no idea what managers did, what kinds of, you know, challenges or obstacles they faced, or what kind of research they wanted. And recently, I got involved with the California Invasive Plant Council, which is an organization that seeks to bring together land managers who work on invasive plant issues to disseminate information, to have a symposium every year, they have a newsletter and so on. And I really started to, for the first time, recognize both the inadequacy of my understanding of manager issues and start to rethink where my research was going, and also want to get into this question of how it could be more useful. So the first part of today is sort of what I think of as the what managers want part. That's a survey that we did in California asking managers what kind of research they needed and where they got their information. And then the part two is sort of what they get. And here we went to look at the actual literature on invasive plants relevant to California to find out if that matched up at all, if there was a disjunct between what academic scientists are producing and what managers would like to be reading. So the framework here is this idea of a knowing-doing gap. Some people call it the research implementation gap. And it's recognition that this was happening, that there's a gap between the research and the science that accumulates and what people are actually using on the ground. It goes back to the founding of conservation biology, and I'm sure even farther than that. But what I'm going to start off with here is the idea that if there is a knowing-doing gap, if information accumulates about the science of ecology or of management, but it's not being incorporated into management actions, then who can we point a finger at and blame it on? And so one possibility is that it's the fault of those ivory tower academic researchers who are out of touch with what's going on the ground and who don't know what kind of research to do, or the research they do is too inapplicable or too basic or something. And then the opposite idea is that it's really the manager's fault, that the scientists are doing good work, but managers are stuck in their own groove. They just do what they've always done. They don't find new techniques. They don't bother to keep up with the research and so on. And so I'm sure, as you can imagine, there's maybe a kernel of truth in each of those stereotypes. And so to get maybe just a little more in detail with that, these are some of the ideas that have been thrown out for explaining the knowing-doing gap in the past 20 or 30 years. And I want to just go over them really quickly because they're going to pop up as you look at my data, and we'll revisit some of these again. So one is the idea that applied research doesn't have the same status in the academy as basic research or theory development. So it gets published in less highly cited journals, or it's less sexy, or it's less good for promotion in academic careers, and so on. And that can be somewhat true. A second is lack of stakeholder involvement in research agendas. That when scientists sit down to figure out what they want to study or to sit down to write their grant, that they're not necessarily consulting with the users or the people who have a stake in the research. A third possibility is that the information is out there, the science is there, but managers can't get access to it because they're not at universities where there are research libraries, or for whatever reason they don't have the ability to get a hold of that information. Next would be lack of interdisciplinarity. So this is the idea that scientists can be extremely narrowly focused on what they do without being able to draw connections to societal needs or to think more broadly about working with people from other disciplines to make solutions instead of focusing on their narrow issue. Another one is scientific expertise. So maybe managers are not able to understand or to put into practice the information that comes out because they don't have the expertise or the scientific literacy to read and understand it. Another is mismatch of scale. We're going to talk about this quite a bit. Management often happens at the 1,000-hectare level, and research typically at the meter squared level, right? So the plot level. And there's a definite mismatch there. And then finally, to the extent that managers are using science to inform their actions, maybe we don't know that they're doing that, or maybe we don't know that what the results are. So there may be a lack of feedback about what kinds of things have been suggested and are being tried, but we don't know if they're working or not. So all of these are possibilities, and there are more, but these are the ones that are going to come up again. And so I've kind of given them a little shorthand here, relevant stakeholders, access, and so on, so you'll see them pop up on my slides as we go on. So the method for the first part, the what do managers want part, was that we sent out an online survey. And we used the California Invasive Plant Council database to put together 403 organizations that had some kind of authority over land management in the state, and contacted people who seemed to have decision-making power to ask them about how they used information. And so I'm going to make just a little plug here for California being a good case study for this. It's a big state. It's a biodiversity hotspot. We have lots and lots of species in a very diverse flora, a very diverse set of biomes. And it's also highly invaded. And about 200 of those species are considered high-impact invaders in wildland. So this is leaving out the crop pests and leaving out everything that's not plants. We still have 200 high-impact invaders. And a lot of our land is true in much of the West, is in public ownership. And there's a whole hodgepodge of different kinds of organizational structures that govern this land, everything from the feds to utility districts, and even land that is maybe owned by a city but is actually being managed by a private firm, nonprofit or for-profit contractor. And we have a network of information distribution and research, starting with the weed management areas. Do you guys have weed management areas here? Okay, so we have, they'd actually in California just got defunded 2 years ago, so they're now budgetless, but their structure kind of sort of still exists. There's Cal IPSI, which I've mentioned, and then we have one of the biggest public university systems in the nation, including the 10 UC campuses and their associated extension agents, some of whom do work in wildlands on invasive plants and range management. So who are our managers? A little over half working for governments and tribes, very experienced. The median experience level was more than 10 years. Very well educated, with almost half having advanced degrees. And they all did some decision making. So if people answered that they didn't do decision making at their organization, we threw them out of the database. And we ended up with 207 respondents out of our 500 plus contactees. So one question to start off with is, do the managers think that there is a knowing doing gap, that the research is not getting used, or that research is not being made that they can use? And so only about less than a quarter thought that their priorities were well represented in what scientists wanted to do. And so from there we asked three basic questions. Where do they get their information? What kind of information did they actually generate by means of experiments or monitoring? And if they had their druthers, what research questions would they like to see more of? So here's the first result. This was extremely dismaying to me because peer-reviewed journal articles are my bread and butter. That's where I'm supposed to be publishing. That's where when I get an article in a peer-reviewed journal, I think I'm done. And so the peer-reviewed journal articles ranked dead last. So those are ranked in order, and then the numbers are the average ranks. Of course, the lower the rank, the lower the number, the higher the rank, right? So at the top are essentially informal interactions. So talking to other managers or relying on their own judgment from what they see in the landscape. And then kind of more or less tied after that is formal scientific research, but that has been distilled in some way, either by a talk at a symposium or some of the newsletters, books, and websites that kind of make the accumulated science more palatable for a management readership. And then they're at the bottom where I do my work. And then we looked at the 20 journals that publish the most invasive plant research, and we asked for each one of them, we asked managers, do you read this journal, do you consult it, and if you do you often, sometimes, rarely, or never find relevant articles in it? And so what you're looking at here is the kind of summation of all of those journals, and the way to think about this is that the average journal received that response from this percentage of the managers. So about 60% of the managers, or about the journals on average had 60% of the managers saying that they'd never consulted it. And sometimes relevant only raised to about 22%. So really the managers are not seeing the journals as being terribly relevant to what they do. We also asked for people who said that they never consulted peer-reviewed journals why that was. And the top answer was they just don't have time. Time to find them and time to read them. But here are some of those things coming up again. Access. Right? So more than half said that they didn't have library access sufficient to get a hold of them. There was also this relevance question. Notice, though, that that's smaller than the access and the time question. So fixing the relevance of the research might not actually help managers get a hold of it if they don't have the time or the ability to get it. And then expertise was a very small component. Very few people said they didn't have the expertise to read them. Okay, so this is very dark. I put this in red because I thought that I might be boring, and that occasionally, if you had fallen asleep during the data parts, you could wake up for a big red slide of recommendations. But now I see that it's hard to read, so I'll just read it off to you. So these are things that I think scientists can do better to address some of the things I've just talked about. One is to publish in open access journals. Right? Typically you pay a fee to put your article, after it's been peer reviewed, pay a fee to put your article in it, but then anybody with an internet connection can read your article presumably forever. Another is to come to talk to management audiences at symposia or to write for their newsletters. And the third is to publish in journals that require a lay summary. So not everybody calls it that, but for instance, rangeland ecology and management require that every article published then have a highlights paragraph that goes in rangelands, which goes to a much broader and more diverse audience. I love that. That there's an attempt to at the outset, if you want to get your article published in our journal, then you're going to have to make sure that there's an accessible piece of that that sums it up for a user audience. Okay, so the next piece of this was, remember, asking what kinds of information do managers actually generate. And so the vast majority of managers in our survey said that they use experiments or monitoring to inform themselves about management actions against plant invasions. And so we asked them a little bit in more detail, what is that science like? What kind of science are you doing? And here, these don't add up to 100% because they could answer multiple answers. So most people are doing, they're looking at things for more than 1 year. They're testing a couple of techniques against each other, comparing to a reference site. But when you look at the things that are hallmarks of formal science, of the kind of science that would get published, using a control, randomizing, doing statistics, those are half or less of the managers who say that they do experiments and monitoring are doing that. And so this speaks a little bit to this quote by Cabin. If you don't know this paper, but you are interested in restoration, I recommend it to you. It's kind of a rumination on whether science is of any use to management, or whether the formal science that gets published is more useful than the kind of tinkering that goes on at a lot of restoration projects. And he distinguishes kind of an idea of science that is about careful and systematic data collection versus the formal hypothesis testing that is what's required to get into a peer-reviewed journal, and essentially says we don't necessarily have the answer as scientists that we're doing the right kind of science. Then we asked them what they did with the results that they get from their experiments and monitoring. And this mirrors, to a large extent, what we found about where they go for information, which is that the top ways that they disseminate results are informally on their network of people that they already know. So just these conversations with managers and internal reports and maybe a talk at a symposium. But generally, as you increase the amount of effort that it takes, as well as, not coincidentally, the amount of reach or spread of the information, it becomes less frequent in the manager's estimation. And then we asked, if you don't do experiments or monitoring, why not? And I'll just point out that, again, expertise was a pretty low component of this. It was, again, funding and time constraints. Okay, so another very dark and unreadable slide. This is some of the things I think managers can do better. So one is to think experimentally when planning what to do for management. So is there a natural control that can be compared to a treatment, or is there a mosaic of treatments that can be laid out at the same time and used to feed back to other managers or back to scientists? The second is this idea of getting quick and dirty data. And I'll talk a little bit about a friend of mine who works in Southern California on invasive plants at Star Ranch, who is a proponent of, when something happens on their 4,000-acre ranch, figuring out quickly, maybe not with the replication and the statistical power that would be publishable, but trying to do a couple of quick experiments to figure out what the next best step is, and then to test that more deeply. And then finally, to contribute those results when they come about, either at a place like this, at a conference or symposium. In California, we have online weed mapping, so people are trying to contribute the data for where they've done control or where they've spotted invaders to an online map, and then the peer-reviewed journal, the peer-reviewed literature as well. So I talked about this just a minute ago. Sandy DeSimone, practitioner scientist, she wrote this nice paper in Restoration Ecology last year. Again, an opinion article, kind of a rumination on what it means to involve science and management as a practitioner. And she says that her technique is sort of threefold. Yes, review the scientific literature, look at the peer-reviewed stuff, but also this quick and dirty experimentation to get an initial sense of where to go with the next treatment, or to eliminate some options in a mosaic of treatments. And third, ecological intuition, by which she means she's been around a long time. She knows the landscape pretty well. She has a sense of how things respond. And all three of those, I think, are important characteristics of the way that they manage plants and people and at Star Ranch. Okay, shifting gears just into the third part of the manager survey, we asked them what kinds of research they would like more of. How would they set research priorities? And we did this with an open-ended question. So unlike what had come before, which was all kind of check-in-the-box stuff, we just said, what research questions would you like to have answered so you could be better at your job? And of course, we got a huge variety of responses, right? People could write anything, from the ultra-specific to the very general, and from the kind of grounded, very detailed, practical stuff to very thoughtful, big picture questions. So our challenge to analyze this was to code and classify all the responses so that we could kind of sort them out into different kinds of responses and do some statistics on them. Now, I'll just back up here and talk about a study that did something kind of similar in the invasion literature prior to ours. This was in South Africa. They actually did detailed, lengthy, in-person interviews with managers and conservation practitioners in South Africa and asked them what they thought the research needs were. And what I found interesting about this and why I mention it is that it didn't come out, all like we want more applied. It was actually the topics that they identified were about 60% basic science. So 60-40, and I'll just show you the second slide here, details what they were considering the applied research topics in invasive plant management. But what happened in our study was that we didn't actually get just two categories. So we had the basic, sure, and we had the applied, yes, but there was also this third category that we had trouble classifying at first. And in fact, I'm still not exactly sure what to call it. Sometimes I've called it transdisciplinary, sometimes interdisciplinary, sometimes social science or policy context. But if you can, just from the examples here of different kinds of, these are actual responses that people made, they're thinking about the political and social context in which they work, including things like conflicting mandates from different agencies. Like how do we, we're supposed to do weed management over here, but we have an endangered species there and we can't spray herbicide because of that. Or how are we going to deal with the permitting burden? How can we make the permitting burden of all of these different things we have to do lighter so that we have more time to actually control invasive plants? So those kinds of things popped up, and they weren't the kinds of questions that I thought of myself answering or anybody that I knew answering, and I realized that we had to have this third category and that we're going to need to make friends with the social scientists across the hall. So I don't know what to call it, but it's a green wedge, social science policy context, about 30% basic and about 40% applied science as we judged the responses that the managers made. So I'm going to give you just a little sense of how those questions sorted out, what kinds of things our managers wanted more of. One was this idea I'd mentioned before about a scale mismatch. Managers really would like us to do things longer and bigger. And then a second idea was that I kind of categorized as unease with the way things are going, or not being sure that the techniques that they're using are right. So one question was, how do we know when it's okay to stop, just to give up, to stop trying to eradicate the species that seems like it might be futile? Are our efforts being wasted? Or how do we know what the impacts are going to be of our management itself? If I spray herbicides here, and I'm a plant person, so I only am looking at whether the percent cover of the invader goes down, am I also hurting frogs downstream that I don't have any knowledge of? So negative consequences of management, figuring out how to do a better job of early detection, those were things that seemed to speak to some question about, yeah, we're out there on the ground doing stuff, but not entirely sure that it's the right stuff. These are some of the categories from the basic questions. And here, what I'll highlight are some issues that managers, I think, would like to be able to be predictive about what's going to happen in the future. So how are my plants native and non-native, going to respond to global change, climate change, nitrogen deposition? Is it going to be wetter or drier in my area? What's going to happen with succession? If I eradicate this invader, am I going to get something even worse next? Is this community, if my invader spreads, is that community going to be more or less likely to repel it? Things like that. And what's great about these topics, and the reason that I highlight them, is that if you're an ecologist, a researcher who works on theoretical questions, these are actually right up your alley. Right? These are things that, it's like restoration is the litmus test of ecology. If we actually know anything about succession, or if we know anything about community ecology, then we should be able to answer these questions, and managers care about them. Right? And this would actually be useful for risk assessment or for predicting the future. So I feel like we still are not quite there in getting to the point about what's responsible for the gap. Is it lack of relevance, or is it something else? And for that, we really need to go to the literature and find out if those topics are represented well in the literature or not, because we also have issues of access and time and expertise and so on revolving around it. Before I get to the literature part, just a couple more responses from the survey that I want to share with you. We asked them if they had suggestions for bridging this gap. And unsurprisingly, the top one was, well, do more applied research and we'll be happy. And ask us what we want. And work at appropriate scale. So this, again, is that question of scale mismatch. But also, a few managers said that they're on their own. They needed to do more of their own research rather than relying on scientists to do the right thing. And then these are some open-ended responses that we got. So I mentioned this before, problems of scale, both in space and in time. And then budget, right? Very high on managers' list of priorities, not so much on scientists' list of priorities. And I'll, because of the way these responses came out, we actually tailored our inquiry into the literature a little bit differently, and I'll show you how our analysis of the literature came out. Okay, let me take a deep breath. It's a long talk, it's like an hour. We're going to be here for a while. This is the second part of the data. These are the same 20 journals that we had asked managers if they consulted before. They're the ones that published the most invasive plant research. And we looked through them over 5 years of publication for articles that we thought at least had a fighting chance of being relevant to California managers. So either they were authored by somebody affiliated with a California institution, or the work took place at a California field site, or it concerned one of the 41 most impactful wildland invaders as determined by an expert panel of the Cal Invasive Plant Council. And this came out to 347 articles, and by God, we read every single one of them in their entirety. We didn't do a keyword search or an abstract search. We actually read, I and my undergraduates read all of them. And here's what we read them for. This is kind of a, we went through classifying them by certain criteria. So this is a snapshot in the middle of an Excel file that was produced from the in the database. It shows you some of the things that we were measuring. I'm not going to go through all the things at the top because I'm going to talk about them on the next slide. But I'll just tell you that either 2 or 3 of us read every article, and then if there were any discrepancies between our judgment about any of these criteria, then we went back and reread it and resolved it. So my undergrads really got to know the California invasive plant literature very well. They haven't thanked me for that. So these were our major questions. First of all, what about this mismatch in the balance of applied, basic, and transdisciplinary? And then what about a mismatch between specific research topics? Do the specific things that managers said they wanted turn up in the literature at about that same rate? Third was what kinds of spatial and temporal scales are research occurring at? Fourth was, are there overstudied or understudied invaders? And then we wanted to know, when people did basic research, were they at least thinking about the management implications of that work? Were they talking at all about how it could be useful to managers? And when they were doing applied research, which was assumed to be useful to managers, the question we asked was, are they talking at all about how much it costs to do those treatments? And then the last one was about accessibility. How long does it take? Are the results timely? Do they come out in a reasonable number of months, years, decades? And how accessible are those results to the managers? So here, this is from my earlier slide. This is what managers said they wanted. This is what they want for it. And here's what they get. So you can see that the actual mix is extremely heavy on basic science. And it shouldn't be surprising that the green wedge gets so small, because we wouldn't necessarily expect that kind of social science-focused research to be published in these plant ecology and management journals. So that doesn't surprise me over much. But compared to what managers want, the amount of applied research is quite low. So for basic research, do scientists give explicit management recommendations? We had 3 classifications. Maybe they didn't mention it at all. Maybe they mentioned it in passing. And here's some actual examples from the papers of what it meant to be mentioned in passing. We set the bar really low, I thought. We feel this study yielded information of value to grassland managers. Well, good for you. You get a point for saying you think that it was useful. You didn't say why. You didn't say what result was useful or how it could be useful, but at least you mentioned managers. So, as I say, very low bar. Recommendations made, the criterion was that they had to say how their specific results would inform a particular management action. Okay, so because of what we found, you should do this. So what do you think? Any guesses? How much of the research would you say, as a percent, would give explicit management recommendations? Throw out some numbers. Come on. Oh, pessimist. It was much better than that. I was surprised too. That's why I set you up. But more than a third actual explicit recommendations made, and more than half are at least talking about it, at least trying to make a management connection. So good on them. Then we wanted to know about the specific matchup between topics and managers' choices. So what I'm showing you here is a mismatch graph. And what I did is I took the actual, so for any topic category, I took the actual percentage in the literature and I subtracted the percentage in the manager's responses. So the way to read this is that if it's at the 0 line, it means that they match exactly. If the bar is above the line, it means that that topic is overrepresented in the literature. And if the bar is below the line, it means that it's not as well represented in the literature as managers would like. And so the first thing you can see is that there's a category over there at the right called other. Okay? So other are things that appeared in the literature but couldn't be categorized as any of our manager topics. So the very existence of the other category means that everything, like most of the other things, kind of have to be below the bar. But it's still interesting that there are, you kind of see the degree to which things are over or underrepresented. So I'm going to give you my nickel version of why I think these particular things are or how they kind of sort out. So these 3 categories: how invaders spread, general life history information, and information about their impacts, is really basic stuff that any manager would want to know to do a risk assessment. Right? You need to know what the species does, and if you should care about it and where it's going to go. There's quite a surprising lack for many species of information on just the basics. And then the second is these questions that I said before aligned well with theory that have to do with predicting or being proactive about management, about knowing where to prioritize and what's going to happen in the future. And I included seed bank stuff in there because a lot of people want to know how long the seed bank of an invader lasts, to know if it's going to be 100 years of pulling and weeding or just 10 or just 3 years. And then the things that are overrepresented are the things that ecologists like, species interactions. But I'll say that I don't, and community ecology type stuff. I don't think that this means that it's not useful to managers. I don't know why it didn't turn up. I actually think that things like knowing whether your invasive plant is pollinated by a native species or eaten by a native herbivore is useful, but those things didn't rise to the top of the manager survey for some reason. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing, the same kind of graph, except for the applied research topics. So here's that mismatch again, and I would say that the things that are, and again, we have an other bar, the things that tend to be relatively overrepresented are information about techniques that we're already using in great number, biocontrol, integrated pest management, and mechanical control, fire and grazing, as invasive plant management, and so on. But the underrepresented categories are, again, speaking to this unease or uncertainty about what managers are doing now. So can we abandon management? What are the negative consequences of management? How are we doing on, are we doing the right thing but at the wrong time? Those kinds of issues. And those are almost non-existent in the literature, actually, at least in this slice of literature that we looked at. Okay, so I'll read these off to you. What scientists can do better. Recognize and state explicitly the management implications of basic research, especially when doing this kind of predictive work on community invasion resistant succession and global change. Second thing is to communicate with managers about what kinds of basic research is needed. That life history stuff and dispersal stuff is pretty key. And then third, to address the transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary questions by making friends across the hall, the social sciences. And what can managers do better? One is to communicate your research needs to scientists. So if there's a question that you can think of and you could know if that was something suitable for an intern or an undergrad thesis or a PhD or whatever, call up somebody at the university and see if they've got a student who wants to take it on. I know at Elkhorn Slough Estuarine Reserve in California, the director there has about a 20-page document of questions ranging from geology and hydrology to vegetation to invasive invertebrates, marine invertebrates, and all kind of categorized as this is undergrad level, master's level, PhD level, and she just sends it around to people and says, you got a student, put them on this. And she's had a lot of success with that strategy of thinking of the questions that she wants and putting them in the hands of people who have students to address them. And then second, I've seen this at CalIPSI, encouraging your professional society to do a research needs assessment. CalIPSI convened an expert panel to look at the next 20 years of invasive plant research in California and decide what the priorities ought to be. It's another way to get stakeholder concerns into the research agenda. Okay, so I promised that we were going to take up this issue of timeliness, of how long it takes for information to get into the hands of the users. Any guesses? So the way we did this, I'll just tell you, it's pretty crude. We took a look at what the publication year was, and we just subtracted the year of the last dated experimental observation. So any of the papers in the database that didn't have dated observations didn't count. What do you think? Years. Yeah. Oh, pessimistic. 3. So it was just over 3.7 years. And don't take that last digit too seriously, because as I say, it's a pretty crude measure. And we looked at this a couple of ways. One of the ways we looked at it was to ask if you did a longer study, did it take you longer to get your results up? No, it was pretty much consistent around 3.5, 4 years, regardless of how much data you had. And the record for longest time to publication was 15 years for a greenhouse study that was 1 year of data. All right, what about this budget question? When do scientists mention treatment costs? Keep in mind this is just the applied papers that we asked this, so it's a pretty small data set. 2%, which is to say 2 actual papers, details costs in terms of dollars or hourly costs. And another 10 or 11 said something like, this is a good technique because it costs less than that technique, but they didn't say actually how much that is. So pretty scarce on that. We talked a lot about scale mismatch, so here's the spatial scope of the studies in the database. So this is just concerning the papers that had experiments in them. About 20% don't get out of the greenhouse or the lab, and the majority of them, or the largest portion of them, are working in a single habitat type like grasslands at a single site like a park or a preserve. Multi-site single habitat would be grasslands at 2 different parks and preserves in different places, And multi-habitat would be something like serpentine grassland and Mediterranean grassland, or two different habitat types. So this, as you can see the effect of convenience here in terms of the spatial scope. What about time? So this is how long did studies last? One of our managers said, we need things that last longer than a PhD thesis. So PhD thesis is usually 2 or 3 years of data most. And when we look at just the experimental work, we find that all but about 20% of the studies are within that time frame. So more than 40% in a year, and another 30+% lasting 2 or 3 years. And then once you get past that threshold for PhD data, it drops off considerably. All right, this is another one that is going to be, I found kind of surprising. We looked at the taxonomic distribution of the studies in the database. So this is just work where the species were mentioned and they were in California. So we do have some California researchers who are working invaders in Hawaii. We didn't count them. Almost half of the studies were in 4 species. And they're distributed like this. So here in Wyoming, you may not think this is such a bad thing. But when we asked the managers in the original survey what their most troublesome invaders were, it looked like this. We don't care a whole lot about cheatgrass or spotted knapweed because the aerial extent of those species in California is pretty small. What people really care about is yellow star thistle, which doesn't get as much play as it does in literature. And I don't necessarily expect it to match up perfectly, but certainly if you're a manager and you want to know something about arundo donax. Do you guys have arundo here? No, it's a riparian invader. It bogs up navigation, it clogs streams, and it decreases the quality of litter to the food web for invertebrates, which then affects salmon and so on. So we care about it a whole lot. 15% of managers said it was their high priority species, the one that they found most troublesome. Its representation in literature was quite small, even though we searched the literature for this species to see how it was represented. Meanwhile, of those 41 high impact invaders, 7 of them were in the database with only 1 study over 5 years, and 5 were not there at all. So imagine you're working on one of these species, and you go to literature, and there's nothing, Zipola, right? So there's definitely a skew towards particular species that people study. And again, you understand that people like to specialize, and cheatgrass and spotted knapweed are very bad in some parts of the world, and right, so people have a good reason to be continuing to study that. But there's a little bit of the, I don't know, the Drosophila or E. coli effect, where people get really good at one species and want to study it again and again and again, but to the exclusion of stuff that managers would like to know a lot more about. Then we asked, how accessible are articles in the literature? Because access was something that had been mentioned. People don't have library access. So we first looked at 3 kinds of ways that things could be accessible. So a lot of researchers post PDFs of their work on their own websites or in digital archives. Some people, because of copyright restrictions, just put up a draft version, like a submitted version or a Word document that has all the information but not the formatting. And then some people pay the extra fee, which can be $1,500, $2,000, $3,000 for open access privileges. And those were actually quite a large portion of the papers in the database, with just over 1/3 of them being entirely behind the paywall, being totally inaccessible to somebody who doesn't have a university level subscription to the journal. So access may not, as this kind of, I think, changes over time, as more and more open access journals become available, more and more researchers have either their own websites with papers or digital archives at their universities, I think that will become smaller. We did this just by looking at Google Scholar. So again, what can scientists do better? What I've put here at the top is to use the experiment that is management to expand the spatial, temporal, and taxonomic scale of research. In other words, we scientists don't always have to start from scratch in designing an experiment at the meter squared plot level, say this is what we want to test, when management is itself an experiment that's going on at much larger scales all the time, right? So if we can connect with the people who are doing management on large scales and use those actions as experimental techniques, and this requires some cooperation from managers as well, then I think things can be done at the scales that are really useful. And second is to make sure that treatments that are tested are cost effective by working with managers, and then to publish that cost information so that other people know how feasible it would be at their own site. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up here with some overall conclusions and recommendations. And I just want to give a shout out to our afternoon session. There's a panel discussion about this later. I'm going to have time for questions when I'm done, but I'm hoping that in addition to these suggestions or recommendations that I'm throwing out, that you'll have your own, and we can have a good conversation about that later. But it's clear to me that managers need scientific researchers because it's not really their job. They don't have the time and funding to do research on their own. But they do probably have time to inform, considering that they're using a lot of their own data to inform themselves, to add some rigor in this kind of quick and dirty data approach, and to try to help set the research agenda and recruit scientists to work on their issues by being explicit about those questions that they need help on. As far as what kinds of research we should be doing, practical applied stuff is at the top of the list, but there's also a ton of basic questions out there that need more attention and that would appeal to people who are working purely in, or who are inspired mostly by the ecological theory as opposed to the usefulness of the outcome. And then there's this unmet need that's very strong for research addressing broader interdisciplinary questions about the social and political context in which managers work. So I think that if scientists really want to be useful to management, we need to start and end with the users, the stakeholders. And when I say start, I mean start when you design your experiment and end when you put that research into the hands of somebody who can actually use it. And especially that last part, I think people in my position have not really appreciated well. We think that it's a pipeline. We think that you do your research and you put it in the pipe and it goes out and then voila, people can use it because it's in the pipeline. But that model, I think, is a bust because there's a lot surrounding the kind of the knowledge system and the way information is used that defies that. And as a kind of sad example, I want to tell you the story that I heard at ESA this year from Pam Matzek, who had worked, she did great research in the Yaqui Valley, where it's kind of the green revolution for wheat in Mexico, and the farmers there are really upping their wheat yields. But they've done it with very heavy fertilizer applications, and the nitrate runoff to the Sea of Cortez, and also greenhouse gas emissions from the fields that are nitrogenous gases have been environmental problems associated with that fertilizer use. So these Stanford folks went down to the Yaqui Valley, and they looked at the timing of fertilizer applications, so a pure fertilizer management question. And they found that the farmers could apply less fertilizer overall if they timed it differently, added it a little bit later in the season when the wheat was more able to take it up. And so it was this big win-win. And I have presented, I've taught this in my classes, and I've talked about it to people, like, look what they did. They figured out this great solution. Everybody's happy. The farmers make more money. The environmental problems are less, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, the Stanford researchers made the very bad mistake of going back to the Yaqui Valley some years later to see if anybody had adopted it, and found that virtually none were actually using this great solution. And it was not because they hadn't been working closely with the farmers, not because they had just thrown the information in the pipeline, because they hadn't really understood all of the factors that went into the decision making. And one of them was that these farmers had to get loans from a credit union in order to finance their farming season. And the credit union said, you have to do what the extension agent says, and the extension agent says this is how much fertilizer you have to apply if you want to get your loan. So the win-win solution had neglected an important part of the cultural and knowledge system of those farmers and was not being adopted. So now they've gone back and they're trying to work on that. But that just spells out for me that just doing science, and even just doing the good science that seems to produce a win-win solution, isn't sufficient. Right? So we have to be really strategic and really thoughtful about how we link science to management. And again, I hope we'll have a good chance to talk about that later this afternoon. So I would like to acknowledge my co-authors and my funders. This work was partly funded by the Nature Conservancy. The names around Santa Clara University are all undergraduate students, terrific undergraduate students who have done a lot of work on this. And I'm grateful to Calypsy for all the support that they provided this. If you're interested in seeing this in some other form, the first part has been published. And of course it's open access, right? So anybody can get it. It's in the journal Conservation Letters. And I am working on part 2, the what they get part, right now. And hope to beat that 3.7-year threshold with my own work. So thank you very much. So I think I missed the important verb or noun in the first sentence when I was half listening to Brian. So could you repeat your question? Why weren't they included? Because the number of articles that concerns invasive plants did not rise to the top 20. Yeah. So we looked at the top 20 journals worldwide in terms of the number of articles about invasive plants. But that's a very good point, that because the rangeland journals would focus a lot on the grasslands of the West, that there is certainly relevant articles that we would have missed, and very applied ones that we would have missed in our database. So, oh, sure. So the question was about what the reception of this work has been from colleagues at my own university. So a couple of things. There's been some hand-wringing, right? We all know that we should do better on these issues. But I'm lucky enough to work in an environmental science department, so we all, environmental studies and sciences, so we all consider ourselves interdisciplinary. And some years ago, when I was looking for a job, I was applying to biology departments. And a friend from the Nature Conservancy said, "You're not a biologist, you're an environmental scientist." And what the heck does that mean? I don't even know, of course I'm a biologist, because I was trained as a biologist. But I have come to think that environmental science does a better job of trying to make those connections, and that in environmental science departments you often find more people who are willing to be interdisciplinary in that way. So I have a small department. I think they've received it well and are working on some similar issues themselves. Not to knock on the biology departments of the world, but there is a sense of interdisciplinarity that we get in environmental science. Questions? So the question is whether I have a soils component to my work. And do you mean this particular? So the managers identified soils and soil microbial interactions with invasive plants as one of the topics that they wanted more of. So that's the way that principally came out. A lot of what's there is actually the work coming out of Ray Calloway's lab on allelopathy and cheatgrass. Cheatgrass, right? No, spotted knapweed. So that particular kind of soil interaction dominated the category. It's not exactly what I think the managers were asking for more of. So it could maybe answer that either way. No. I mean, I actually do work on soils for my research, but not in this. Well, I'll have to say, so the question is, have the journal editors sort of reacted to a sense of a mismatch between what their audience wants and what they're publishing? And I would say no, because I think each journal has its niche and it thinks it knows its audience. And just because that's not a management audience doesn't mean that they see any need to change things. But there are certainly journals that do a better job of insisting either on this lay summary or something like conclusions or implications, sort of a so what section at the end of the article. And I'd like to go back and kind of see if we can figure out, maybe the quickest way is to actually just look at the journal author guidelines as opposed to looking at the papers themselves. But it seemed clear when we were reading them that journals that had a section where it was required of the author that they do this had it, and those that didn't did not. All right, well, thank you very much.
I'm sure you guys will think of some more questions for the panel discussion.